Gray was a kid I knew a while back in my childhood days. He was my best friend back then, and probably still would have been if he hadn't passed away. Gray wasn't his real name, but he told us to call him that because he said that was the color that best reflected everything he lived for. He had a lot of friends at school, and he got along well with most people, but if you knew him well, you could tell that there was something missing in his life. He hated most things, although he didn't show it, and during one cold winter many years back, Gray's depression got worse, and that was his last winter alive. Gray, after multiple suicide attempts, had somehow never been able to carry out his own killing successfully. And in late winter, Gray finally got his wish and died, and he didn't even have to kill himself. It was February 9th, 2002, and it was unusually warm, at least for February. The snow from the week before was melting rapidly and producing mush and puddles on the sidewalk, and I was biking over to Gray's house because he had called me 20 minutes earlier and he'd asked me to come over. Gray's parents had left him alone for the weekend on business or something, and he planned on making the most of it. You know, I must have been one of the few friends actually willing to go all the way out to his house, because it was about as far away as you can get from civilization where we were. I reached his house, and I chained my bike to a tree in his front yard, and as usual I let myself in. And right away I noticed a strange silence upon entering his house. Gray's mom was usually there yelling at him, but even in this case, when she was gone, the sound of the video games or music or something could be heard from his bedroom. I was in the dining room, and I looked around for Gray. I called out for him, and I didn't get a response. I walked through the door on my left, and I entered his living room, and I looked around, and there he was, on the couch, right in front of the TV. To this day, I still cannot even attempt to imagine what happened to me the instant I saw Gray. I was shocked, but at the same time, disgusted, terrified, and so many more emotions. At that moment in time, I drifted away from reality further than I'd ever been before. I was no longer human, but completely insane. I screamed so loud that the neighbors who lived about 5 miles away probably heard me. And I screamed so hard that by the time I was finished, I had almost passed out because my lungs were about to collapse. Gray was sitting on his couch, motionless, with an enormous hole through his mouth and an enormous hole through the back of his head, and there in his hands was a shotgun. And there I was at the end of the couch, screaming like I never screamed before. It seemed like an hour before I got up on my feet and walked over to Gray. And once I got over to him, I broke down yet again, fell down to my knees, put my head in the couch right next to his body, and began sobbing so hard and so long for what was probably another hour. When I finally stopped crying, it was beginning to get dark. In the house there, just like before, was complete silence. I just sat there for a while thinking. Everything I'd ever thought in my life went through my head right then for a good few minutes, and then it all stopped. And there was nothing. From the silence came nothing. And then I heard the faintest breathing, like the breathing of a dying animal. And I looked up at Gray, whose face was a gory mess from the nose down and the eyebrows up. But between those two giant holes in his head, his
eyes were perfectly intact and functional, and they were staring right down at me. And as I caught his gaze with my own, well, I went into a state of paralyzed shock that held me there staring for 10 minutes. Gray didn't move his eyes, and neither did I, and for a while, the only sound that could be heard was the soft, dying breath that was coming from Gray's chest. Gray finally broke the focus by releasing a groan from his throat. It was almost as quiet as his breathing, and I decided to shift so that I was kneeling directly in front of Gray, looking him straight in the eye, and I somehow managed to summon up the strength to talk. I said, "Gray, why did you do this?" And I knew Gray couldn't answer me. His mouth had been shot off, but I was still surprised when Gray just started crying. For the first time I had seen them there, he was crying and his tears were red like wine. And then we just sat there, staring at each other for a while. Gray tearing up silently, wine dripping down his cheek as he did so. And I just couldn't imagine a more painful situation than the one Gray was sitting in. And even if they could somehow save him, well, he'd never think the same. And thinking these terrible thoughts while I was staring at him was probably what made me ask my next question, which is a question nobody should have to face themselves dealing with. I asked him, "Do you want me to finish the job?" And after a moment's silence, Gray moaned the smallest sound of approval. And so, without a word, I relieved Gray of the shotgun that he was still holding in his lap. I stood up and I held it straight to his face. I only hesitated for a few seconds to get a final look at my friend, whose eyes were streaming red. I knew I couldn't hesitate too long or I wouldn't do it, and I couldn't deny Gray his death wish. In those last seconds, I looked deep into Gray's eyes and saw everything he lived for. I could see his family, his childhood, me, his other friends, all the great times he had and all the miserable ones. Every little thing he did, every place he'd been. And I stared into my friend's eyes one last time. It was the first time that I could truly say to myself that life was beautiful. I sat with Gray in silence for a long time after I killed him. I cried, but I didn't sob or go hysterical or anything like that. I just sat there for a while, crying to myself, looking up at the ceiling, hoping it could tell me where to go from there. I finally decided to call Gray's mom. I called her from the home phone and told her that when I got to her house, I found Gray on the couch, dead, and I called her. But I didn't tell her anything else. I couldn't. No one could know. She was practically screaming at me from the other end of the telephone, in the same hysteria that I faced when I first saw Gray. They never caught Gray's murderer. In fact, they didn't even try to go after him. It was reported as a suicide, and nobody questioned otherwise. I got off the hook, and I guess you could call me lucky, because I'd have been in prison by now if the word got out. And believe it or not, that's exactly what I was afraid of. Prison. Me. Prison. I was afraid of fucking prison. Well, that was 12 years ago, and you know what? I may be free, but I'm pretty fucking pathetic if you ask me. But I won't tell anyone. Not now. Not ever. I'll carry it with me to the grave, and then people will mourn for me as if I hadn't done anything wrong in my life. And then they'll have a big feast at the funeral, where they'll cry over all the good memories they had, and they'll eat bread and wine.